Raise your hand if you've heard of the Peshtigo Fire. No hands? I didn't think so. Well, hey, you motor warriors. I am up here in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and I'd mentioned before that I have some kind of roots here from way back, and I had a great grandmother that was part of this, and she survived the Peshtigo Fire. And I'll probably just take some pictures in here and then tell you more about the Peshtigo Fire and how bad it was. But anyway, this is the building, an old church building where they have the museum. I'll try and take some photos. For the first time in my life, I'm dealing with some pretty intense allergies, so hopefully you can still understand what I'm saying. You know, I've known about the Peshtigo Fire all of my life, but this is the first time I was actually able to get up there. Many years ago, when I lived in Milwaukee for 5 years, I was hoping to get up there then, but it just didn't happen. When we got to the museum, there was some folks that were already there, and a volunteer was telling them some stuff that I already knew for the most part, and her voice didn't pick up, so I'll just do this overdub with some of the stuff that I've written down here for you. This museum not only has some artifacts that survived the fire, but in the lower floors they have some interesting historical items that really had nothing to do with the fire. They are cool, but had nothing to do with the fire. So what's the Peshtigo Fire all about, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. Now first, let me say I normally don't post videos or watch other people's videos that are much longer than 10 to 15 minutes. I just don't have time for that. But this one will be longer. I think if you bear with me, you will learn something that you may also find interesting. In the 1800s, Wisconsin had become a booming area for the lumber industry. Back then, it was common practice to cut down the trees for the lumber and then pile up the unused parts of the tree and just set them on fire. That helped to clear the land and make it better for the farmers to plant in. Well, in 1871, much of the Midwest had been experiencing a severe drought, leaving behind dry conditions that were just screaming for a fire. A number of small fires had been set in a field, and they were left unattended because it wasn't windy. However, as the evening rolled in, so did a very cold storm front. As the cold winds hit the warm air of the fires, it caused the wind to start to swirl back on itself. This caused the wind to blow even harder on the fires, causing them to get hotter, and a cycle just started to go. Well, by the time most folks were in bed, the conflagration, the intense whirlwind of fire, swirled like a tornado of flames, as that's what it was called by the few survivors. The tornado of flames rose up 200 feet. The winds were at least 110 miles an hour. The temperature was over 2,000 degrees. 2,000 degrees. I mean, think about that. The hottest planet in our solar system is not actually Mercury, like most people think. It's actually Venus, and the temperature of Venus is 870 degrees Fahrenheit. So the intense heat from this blazing inferno was more than twice as hot as the hottest planet in our solar system. It was hot enough to turn sand into glass. By the time people realized what was happening, it was too late. The few survivors told of seeing trees literally explode. When the heat would heat up the sap inside the tree, it would just and it would blow up like it had been hit with a bomb. Houses and even fully loaded trail cars, or rail cars, were lifted up and tossed like empty paper bags. Experts today say that it must have been very similar to a nuclear bomb being dropped on them. Intense heat would vaporize people it hit. The few survivors told incredible horror stories that they had lived to witness. One lumberjack put his family in the cellar to run and get help. His wife was peeking through a crack and watched as he dropped and turned to ashes. Many ran to the river, but the water at that time of year is really cold. They would stay under as long as they could, then come up for a quick breath of hot, smoky air. Most did not survive. A number of people clung to a rope going into their wells, thinking that they'd be safe. only to have the inferno suck out the oxygen and consume it with the fire. They suffocated and died inside the well. There was a record of a man that, seeing that death was certain, he cut the throats of his wife and children so they wouldn't suffer, and then he was eventually consumed in those swirling flames. The thoughts of hearing all the screams of fear, terror, pain, and death, and loss, it must have been enough to terrify the toughest, coldest of hearts. Within a mere 2 hours, it turned to ash, a swath of forest land 10 miles long and 40 miles wide, not to mention the town of Peshtigo and many other little towns that were in that area. The intensity of the heat melted the telegraph wires, making it impossible to call for help in Green Bay, the biggest city in the area where they could possibly get some help, but they couldn't get through because the wires were melted. The area of the state was all on its own, left alone to die. There was an important wood product company in Peshtigo, and they employed many people in the surrounding region. But with the entire area left with no trees, it ended the lumber industry in that area for decades, and the company was never able to sustain business. As recent as the 1980s, they've been digging to get a property ready for construction and have come upon mass graves from the Peshtigo Fire of 1871. Many authorities say that the death toll was well over 2,500 men, women, and children. The numbers are hard to set because so many were simply turned to ashes with everything else that burned in those 2,000 plus temperatures. This includes turning all records of the number of people living there, etc., into ash. Also, so many people had died that there was nobody left to identify the bodies of those that were not completely burned up. The population of the township of Peshtigo at that time was only 1,700 people, but there were many little towns and people like my great-grandmother who were visiting from nearby areas. This is the world's worst fire to date. It turned at least 1.5 million acres into ashes in a very short time. The number of recorded stories from the survivors is enough to curdle the blood. I'm only telling you a few. My paternal great-grandmother came to the U.S. alone when she was a young teenage girl. That was pretty rare back then. Spunky lady. She ultimately met my paternal great-grandfather that also lived in that area, as did many folks from Norway back then. He was at a camp far enough away that they had no idea what was taking place. He worked as a lumberjack, and the crew was planning on working until the snows came. He was saving for their upcoming wedding. Well, she went to Peshtigo that day to get her wedding dress and barely survived. There's more to the story, but soon after he got back, they got married and moved south. So why haven't most of you heard of it? Well, because the same evening, some 250 miles south, Chicago caught fire. Well, how did that one start? Well, nobody truly knows, but to this day, many people still believe the story that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over an oil lamp in the barn and that started it. For over a century, that has been what's been taught as the official reason. However, back then, people of Chicago hated Catholics and Irish folks, both of which fit Mrs. O'Leary. They never charged her, but they blamed it upon her because they believed she would be the perfect scapegoat. Even when the truth was told that the politicians were simply eager to please the people by giving them a reason it happened and had made it all up, people still believed it because they wanted to. If you know anything about Chicago, it has always been a city of corruption, organized crime, and shoddy building practices. Due to the thin walls, weak structures, and the closeness of the buildings, when the fire started, it spread. Nothing compared to Peshtigo, but it did do some damage. By the time the, quote, Great Chicago Fire, as it unfortunately has been called, before it was over, it destroyed only 3.3 square miles, roughly 2,100 acres of the city and killed, according to the highest estimate, 300 people. Yet as word got out about the fire in Chicago, millions of 1871 dollars were poured into the city from other cities, states, including Wisconsin, that did not know or realize what was happening in Peshtigo, wealthy celebrities, and even other nations. $1 million back then is worth at least $26 million today, just to give a comparison. So when you're talking about millions flooded in, that was a lot of money. When people started to hear about Peshtigo, especially folks in Chicago, they sent nothing to help. Nothing to help. Is there any wonder why so many people in Wisconsin, especially northern Wisconsin, do not much care for people from Chicago? The, quote, Great Chicago Fire was bad, sure, but it was nothing compared to what was happening to the lumber industry area of Peshtigo, Wisconsin. So to give a little recap, Peshtigo, at least 1,500,000 acres turned to ash. Chicago, 2,100 acres. Peshtigo, at least 2,500 people died. Chicago, at most 300 people died. Peshtigo received zero help in any form. Chicago, millions in 1871 dollars poured in from everywhere and gave nothing to Peshtigo once they heard about it. Peshtigo, the worst fire to date in world history, but few know about it because it happened the same day as the fire in Chicago. Chicago was a tiny campfire by comparison, but it's called the Great Chicago Fire simply because it was in Chicago. Well, thanks for watching, Motor Warriors. I appreciate y'all. I hope you learned something out of this. And I appreciate y'all. And remember to live your lives with the heart of a Viking warrior. Bye for now. That is something else, huh? See the propellers down there? Oops. It's pretty neat, huh? Oh, look at the old hollow logs, digging out the logs to make canoes. Is that cool? It's pretty cool, huh?
Put it back. See, this is information about that. Put it back.
There's a nice big trunk. That's a big trunk.
No, it's for people to read. You have to read it. And you see that? It says, please do not touch. You have to listen to the signs. That's in there.
Okay, this
Do not touch. What it says.
an old clipper. Look at that. I remember those. My dad had something like that. It was probably my grandfather's, but I remember that. You'd squeeze and it would trim for shaving your back of your neck or whatever. Pretty cool. There's just so much in here. It's hard to go through everything for you guys. I don't know what that's all about. And the old phone operator thing. Can you imagine those days? No cell phones. You had to call, ring a dingy dingy, and you'd get somebody sitting at the end like the people there. And then they'd say, hey, John, because they were plugged into your outlet. They knew who you were. You know, hey, John, who you calling? Well, I'm calling Mary. And say, all right, hang on, I'll get your sister right now. And boom, plug the other line into her, and, you know, it was something else. But these dial phones, I remember that. These little button things to take different calls, different lines, those came later. A lot of woodworking stuff. Got a lot of stuff to do with lumbers up here. This really is, a lot of this I don't think has anything to do with the fire. It's just part of the museum of the area and part of history. It's kind of cool. I believe that's how they used to weave cloth back in the day. This is a loom. There's a bean thrasher back there, it says, and all those old tools doing everything by hand. That now we have these heavy duty equipment, these machines that'll do all this stuff. And the crosscut saw. I know that my great whatever grandfather worked in the lumber stuff up in here, and they'd cut down some trees like this, and others they'd get these big hatchets or these big axes, and you'd get like several guys around a tree, and you'd get a rhythm, swack, 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 swack. And one of the guys was drunk or something, and swung before he was supposed to, and hit my grandpa's hand and cut his hand off. So every picture after that you saw my grandpa, that hand was behind his back, so you couldn't see he was missing a hand. Something else, man. Oh, this is a butter churn? Interesting. Okay. Here's a bathtub and the washboards. Used to have an old washboard when I was younger, and I used to put thimbles on my fingers and my thumbs, and you could make music out of it, like Jim Mangrum, Jim Dandy Mangrum from Black Oak, Arkansas. Okay. Some pretty cool stuff. I don't know if y'all like museums or not, but it's pretty cool. Oh, look at that. They got a light in there to make it look like there's hot coals in there. Pretty cool. Yeah. And some old bicycles. What does it say? Anything about the dates or? 18, here, so I can zoom in for you. 1898 for a 2-seater. Huh. Something else, huh? All right. That don't look that old. That looks like a bike I had as a kid. Okay, anyway. A lot of this stuff you guys probably can't even see it anyway. Old skates that you used to connect to your shoes, your boots, or whatever. There's some old bats. And no, I don't mean Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi and, Hillary Clinton. But yeah, there might be old bats too. Well, I don't know how old Kamala Harris is, but she's certainly a dingbat. All right. Types of barbed wire.
It says do not touch. You're supposed to be on here.
Typewriters. And I don't know if you know this, but if you look in here, see how there's ropes under that pad? See how there's ropes under there? That's how beds used to be. They would drill holes in the wood and then tie ropes like back and forth and whatever. And then if you didn't tie the ropes tight, you could slip right through and fall on the ground.
and or have your wake up and your butt's in a hole and you're trying to climb out of it. So the whole thing about, and then they used to stuff mattresses, these little pads down under there. They used to stuff that with straw and different things like that to make it a little bit softer and warmer. So when they're saying sleep tight and don't let the bed bugs bite, you had to pull your ropes tight so you didn't fall through. And then if there was insects or bugs inside the matting, and you could wake up getting bit. So sleep tight and don't let the bed bugs bite came from these old types of beds like that, because you had to pull the rope tight and you want to make sure there's no bugs in the straw. Okay, I think I'm done showing y'all this. I think that was it. I don't know, I think I came in that way, I think.